So for those of you who don't already know Keith, it is my pleasure to introduce him. We were really happy when he was a member of Horizons community several years ago, engaged and thoughtful and consistently helpful and kind member of Horizon. And we were sad to see him go off to UC Santa Barbara, is that correct, for his PhD studies, and excited for what he might accomplish there. And we are happy to have him back. And I know that I'm excited to learn about Keith's research, and yeah, hopefully you're part of our community for a little while longer. So thank you, Keith, and looking forward to seeing what you've got.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Kellen and Jem, for organizing the video too for the Zoom, and everyone who's here virtually. I have a nice intimate group, but I hope, those of you who are watching this, later on will benefit from what's happening and the ideas herein. So why don't we go ahead and get started, I guess. I'll share my screen. Yeah. Okay. So, is this here? Okay. So today I'm going to talk on Sri Sabhapati Swamy and Tamil Yoga in modern occultism. I've given some of the background material in a separate lecture that's available on YouTube, so I won't focus so much on the background of Sabhapati's life, although I think it's important to give some context. And in this particular talk, what I'm going to cover is the historical context of Sabhapati's life and associates, as I mentioned, but also give special emphasis on the integration of yoga in quote-unquote translocal modern occultism via Sabhapati's works, with special focus on Theosophy and the Lema. And I'm also going to talk about the context of Sabhapati's Tamil and Pan-Indian literature, including the literature's spread across South Asia and sort of its main features. So you kind of get a sense of both worlds there. So starting with Sabhapati's life and literature, most of what we know about Sabhapati's life is located in these biographical accounts. One which I call the Ur account, another one which you could call T1 for Tamil 1, it's all in Tamil, and another one that I call T2, right? It's another Tamil account from 1913. And then this Ur account from 1880, which was published actually in a Theosophist, I think first, maybe just a year before, but then published as part of a separate book, was translated as well into Urdu. So it's kind of, a wide spread of contents here for his life. But we're mostly going to focus here on Chennai, which is where Sabhapati was born. And so, we have sort of North India up here and South India here, right? Tamil Nadu and Kerala, some different states, what are today part of India. But at that time, were sort of divided into different presidencies of British India. So Sabhapati was born in the Madras presidency, and in specifically a town called Velachery, which today is the site of the international airport, but at that time was sort of, its own sort of little village on the outskirts of Madras. And so we know he was educated at a school called Free Church Mission School in the 1860s. And that's been since absorbed into Madras Christian College. And his hagiography also records him visiting the Nagore Dargah, which is a Sufi Dargah in sort of southeast India, sort of south of Madras. And here, sort of the reports are that he interacted with, yogis and fakirs here at this site, who sort of may have taught him some principles of yoga, since there's an association with that shrine. And both Hindus and Muslims go here to sort of worship or seek barakat, this blessing from the saint who's there. And we also know, sort of as part of his hagiography, that he left on a textile trade with his father-in-law, since apparently one of the accounts mentions that he was married. And he went to Burma and interacted with Buddhist monks there. So that's kind of part of the story as well. But really, you know, his life starts to pick up in terms of his mission and vocation once we sort of find this temple, Vedashreni Dandishwara Koil, in Madras, where he has this experience, right? It starts with a dream when he's at home. And then he, you know, is feeling unsettled. He's longing for this face-to-face experience with the divine. And he travels here to this temple. And while sort of engaged in this meditation day and night, a voice, you know, kind of comes to him, you know, as either Shiva or the Brahman, right? It sort of varies depending on the source you're looking at, and tells him, go to Agastya's ashram, right? Agastya's hermitage. And so we know that this was a real place, but just to kind of give you an idea of this temple culture, right, of Vedashreni, it's a, you know, you can go there today. They've renovated the temple, and it's really nice. And sort of the old tank, though, is still there without water, like a lot of sort of temple tanks are. But we'll get into Agastya's ashram in a second, because the Tamil accounts also give another piece of information that I won't get too much into, but that also sort of link him to a main guru, or like a parampara, right? Like a lineage of gurus. And his main guru was Chidambara Swami. And so this is a translation of Chidambara Swamigal. And you can kind of look into, you know, the parampara through some research. You know, I invite you to read sort of my chapters or, you know, dissertation forthcoming. And you can sort of see that it's part of this established lineage of a 17th century guru who sort of has a much wider reach in South India. And so sort of following this rabbit trail a little bit, I was able to track down one of these works that's mentioned in Sabhapati's books called The Truth of Instruction, and also sort of this whole network of temples, right? Or you could even say tumuli, right? Like a tumulus where a saint is buried, right? A yogi is buried, and they're called jiva samadhis. And some of them have females who sort of are pujarinis, which is relatively rare in India. So there's sort of a really interesting sort of culture of openness and sort of eclectic practice at these shrines or tumuli. And at the tumuli of his guru, there's actually sort of two individuals who will teach you yoga. If you do go and, you know, show an interest, then they're more than happy to sort of teach you some techniques that are sort of part of the same genre of techniques that Sabhapati himself may have learned from his guru, Chidambara Swamigal. But regardless, he didn't stay there long, right? In Vedashreni, in this temple complex, and sort of his guru who lived nearby this temple. We know that he took a vow of sannyasi and, you know, was really keen on going to Agastya's ashram. But what is Agastya's ashram, right? And so that's sort of something that I've had to trace in some of my research. It's actually a semi-mythical place, but it refers to a specific geographical area, especially a mountain called Agatya Malai, and it's also called Potigai Malai. And there, sort of along the routes to this mountain, we know that Sabhapati stopped at many sacred spots that are renowned for the yoga and the teachings of this group known as the Tamil Siddhars, or Siddhargal. And so, you know, these are sort of yogis as well as alchemists who were later absorbed into sort of this group or category of Swāmigal, or Swamis, just like Sabhapati's own sort of title. And so it's clear that sort of, you know, part of Sabhapati's literature is related to these milieus. And so we know that sort of from the environs where he traveled. So one of these places was also Papanasam, sort of en route, you know, old sort of really famous Shiva temples, you know, with waterfalls and rivers that are renowned for their magical properties, healing properties. And we know from diagrams and maps in his books that sort of there's this, you know, sort of really interesting synthesis of nature and yoga and sort of embodied cosmology, you could say, in the sense that here we have this described as a Triveni, which is known as sort of this root or confluence of three rivers, which we'll get into, in a second, a little bit later, with sort of Ida, Sushumna, and Pingala, right? These three nerves that are in the yogic or tantric body. And these are sort of projected onto nature and geography in South India, just like it is in North India. So it's interesting sort of to follow this, this map and these diagrams and sort of how it all connects. There's like a legend to what is being described behind his yogic practice. And it's also linked to this river here, a sacred river known as the Tamil River. So today, if you go to the Tamil River, you'll still see sort of sadhus at the site. Most of them speak only Tamil, but I was able to speak to some sadhus in this area, and they told me that, back before this hydroelectric dam project was built in the area, people would come and go in the mountains pretty freely. But nowadays it's a little more restricted. But who knows? There's sort of networks of caves, there's networks of other places in these areas, right? And sort of colonial and archival maps clearly show that there were pathways sort of into the mountains up here to Agatya Malay Peak, right? This peak of Augusta's Mountain. And if you sort of follow it as far as you can go, right, as far as the forest police will let you go, you'll find that there are rock carvings of Agastya, statues of Agastya, and Lopamudra, his consort, at this site called Kalyanatirtham. So whether this was sort of part of the area that Sabhapati is describing, as Agastya's ashram or not, it's clear that it's part of this same sort of sacred geography, I guess you could say, that's, embodied in the landscape. So here's another image that you can kind of, get a feel for, it's really still a vast biosphere full of animals and rivers and waterfalls. It's a beautiful place. And here's a sort of earlier depiction of the way it would have been, imagined by Sabhapati, with male and female students and sort of networks of pathways, meditating yogis, sort of all kinds of things happening, right, in the environs of these hills and these mountains. And so just to kind of give you a sense of how this is described, right, you have this account where, he's in a cave, and while eating bulbs and roots, he received all these instructions, experienced all the rites, or the sadhanas, right, obtained all experience. And then, having refuted these through his guidance, the guru's guidance, his individuated non-dual self was united to Brahman by the experience of the steadfast composure in Brahman, which is the yoga of kings for Shiva as Brahman. So we'll come back to this idea of Shiva Raja Yoga or Shiva Raja Yoga in a second, but it's sort of a really critical word in Sabhapati's literature. And it's sort of this kind of composure or samadhi that one can attain. And through it, possess an identity with the Brahman, which in his other works is a form of Shiva, but Shiva not simply as a masculine principle, but Sivam, this sort of, I guess you could say, Godhead that's beyond male and female. So following, though, his experience down here, in the hills of Agastya, what happens is, at least the accounts tell us that he sort of had this fire lit under him to go and spread this message to the world, kind of, a stock hagiography fashion. But it's clear that he really did get around, right? Because, he left this, this ashram of his guru, the caves of his gurus, wherever exactly that may have been. And he left on sort of a pilgrimage circuit to all of these, temples in North India, Kedarnath, Muktinath, Pashupatinath in Nepal today. And then finally ended up in Lahore around 1880, 1879, 1880. And we know that he ended up in Lahore because, well, these books were published out of Lahore. And so you have Vedanta, Vedantic Raja Yoga, which is sort of his first book in English that I'm sort of defining as this alpha stream, right? It's sort of English works. And then to some extent, they were translated into Bengali in the case of this one. But they go on to inform his other literature, which we'll get to later on. But these are really the works that were engaged by occultists as well, as we'll see, this kind of translocal level. So Lahore was kind of a critical place where these books were being published as lectures on Raja Yoga and sort of attracting the attention of, a more sort of Anglophone as well as sort of elite educated populace, even though they contain a lot of transliterated Sanskrit words and sort of traces. We'll get to a kind of more South Indian sort of Tamil yogic content. What we see here is that, his books are really formulated for this audience of English speakers, right? And so he attains this editor there, Sri Sabhapati Swamy, who we'll get to in a second. And so they publish these books, that are reprinted out of Lahore, and they're widely popular in that area, even translated, as I mentioned, into Bengali, and as we'll get to in a second later, in German. So what becomes interesting here in Lahore is that we know that Sabhapati meets Henry Olcott and Helena Blavatsky, who happened to be traveling through. The Theosophical Society had just been founded in 1875. They leave on a trip to India, arrive in Bombay, Mumbai today. And along their sort of traveling circuit, they're visiting Lahore. And while they're in Lahore, Olcott gives a lecture that Sabhapati also attends. And we know that because of Henry Olcott's diaries, not his published old diary leaves, but his actual diary entry that survives in the archives in Adyar in Chennai. So he says he delivered his lecture, right? At the close, Sabhapaty Swamy read a complimentary address, right? Lots of things. The man from Patal, that's a reference to Olcott himself. And he also records that Sabhapaty Swamy sort of came to visit with one Birjlal. And, he says that his talks are all right, but he seems to me a positive humbug, as his is not a spiritual face. So, and he tells an incredulous story about being able to fly bodily 200 miles through the air. Now, this story about flying is about Sabhapati's account of flying to Mount Kailasa, which at that time, as I've just sort of learned relatively recently, was to some extent an entirely mythical place, right? The abode of Shiva. Although later it sort of became identified with a specific mountain in what is today Tibet in China, sort of on the border with India. At that time, it was really still, a semi-legendary mountain abode of Shiva. But Sabhapati recounts this experience of flight as a physical flight. And as we see, sort of, that leads to some level of sort of hesitancy on the part of Henry Olcott and Helena Blavatsky to accept him. Although it wasn't exactly mutual in the sense that Sabhapati Swamy was still sort of really praising these founders of the Theosophical Society, even though he never joined. He published an open letter about being at Lahore, and sort of when he is visiting, he remained with them from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. He had a long conversation with them on the theory and practice of ancient occult sciences. Right, so he's talking about them having this really interesting philosophical exchange, and he's very praising of Helena Blavatsky in this open letter, although only sort of mentions Colonel Olcott in passing. So it's sort of interesting, sort of the what is said and what is not being said as well. So we also know that Sabhapati was in Lahore from his encounter with one Professor J. Campbell Oman. So you can sort of check out if Indian Life, Religious, Social. They're also available on archive.org, these books, right? widely popular accounts of sadhus during the colonial period. And then, you know, Sabhapati's life is also sort of intertwined with this other sort of milieu of texts. As we know, Sri Chandra Boshu, right, also known as Sri Chandra Vasu, right, V-A-S-U, an alternate spelling, right? He published as Sabhapati's editor the first edition of his lectures, but also went on to publish many other works that were accessed by occultists, known as, you know, such as the Shiva Samhita, right, the Sanskrit text from around the 15th century that was translated and then widely available, even accessed by Aleister Crowley, right, who we'll get to in a second, used parts of the Shiva Samhita to sort of construct his idea of the chakras. So Sri Chandra Boshu was a really interesting sort of bridging figure, and, you know, was even known to Max Muller, this, you know, famous Indologist who published the Sacred Books of the East series. And so, you know, he's part of this milieu of, I would argue, translocalizing Sabhapati's literature, right? And Sri Chandra Boshu joined the Theosophical Society, even though Sabhapaty Swamy did not, and remained a lifelong member, although this was after meeting Sabhapaty Swamy. So just to give you some additional context here, there's more of this milieu sort of happening before, and also Allahabad, which today is Prayagraj with the Panini office. They were publishing these books that were widely accessible and sort of accessed by occultists, occult science, such as occult science, the science of breath, which is an interpretation of the Shiva Svarodaya. And, you know, the advertisements are really funny in these texts as well. You know, some T, right? Get your tea. And there's lots of really interesting other sort of tidbits in some of these old publications. But suffice to say, they're part of a wider genre of literature, or like a subset of this genre that is publishing, you know, original Sanskrit works in translation to be accessed by, you know, educated Indians as well as international audiences interested in occultism. Which brings us to sort of where we segue in. We'll get to Sabhapati's later life in a little bit, but what we see here is that Sabhapati's reception among occultists is really sort of one piece of this vast puzzle. And I'm not going to get so much into these other pieces here, but we have a local reception, which is for his students in Tamil Nadu, which doesn't have much theosophy, doesn't have much English, right? And then you also have sort of a pan-Indian that has sort of his literature is trilingual, has Tamil, Sanskrit, and English. There is some theosophy in there, but there's also sort of a lot of, you know, local religious content as well. And then I argue too that they're relocalized in different ways. In one way from these English works that are then relocalized into languages like Bengali, and another way in which sort of these local Tamil practices are sort of translated or relocalized for specific areas of India, whether that's North India, like a Hindustani or Marathi, or even a Telugu speaking audience. So today we're mostly going to focus on this, although we'll get briefly into some of the sources for what this is, because this doesn't just emerge in a vacuum, right? Like there's a source for it. So in talking about the translocal, though, what we need to understand is that, you know, Helena Blavatsky and Henry Olcott are also part of this milieu. For those of you not familiar, I'm sure most of this audience is, you know, of sort of interest in occultism and the occult sciences, right? And so if you go to Adyar today, you'll see, you know, in addition to all of the manuscripts that they've preserved, you'll see sort of memorabilia of Olcott and Blavatsky's time there at Adyar. And what's interesting is that Olcott, in a book, Theosophy, Religion, and Occult Science, wrote about the chakras, right? And talking about Sabhapaty Swamy. And he's talking about this specific diagram, or an earlier version of it. This is a sort of restored version that I was fortunate to have someone paint for me. The circles are the chakras, or centers of forces, and when he has traversed the entire circuit of his corporeal kingdom, he will have perfectly evolved his inner self, disengaged it from its natural state of commixture with the outer shell or physical self. His next step is to project this double outside the body, transferring to it his complete consciousness, and then, having passed the threshold of his carnal prison house, into the world of psychic freedom. So here we have really an explicit linking with, Olcott's vision of chakras and what he saw as the projection of a double outside the body, in this case, an astral double. And so, while there is evidence, though, that Olcott had this sort of initial positive view, what's interesting is that in his later works, he discouraged people from running after yogis, gurus, and hermetic brotherhoods of sorts. And he noted that Sabhapati, is kind to advise people to join the Theosophical Society, but I should like to see his credentials before undertaking to believe that he ever went into or came out of Augustine's ashram. And so this is interesting since, well, first of all, we know that Olcott did travel to around the environs of Augustine's ashram, Papanasam, so he would have heard some stories about it, certainly. And then also this running after, gurus and hermetic brotherhoods may reflect sort of the reality on the ground, competition with Theosophy. And one such of these, orders is the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor that was starting to arise around this time. And sort of it has its, own history, its own documents. It's linked to Pascal Beverly Randolph, a Black American spiritualist, right, who John Patrick Devaney has written about. And it's also linked in some ways to, an interest, at least initially, for some of the members of this brotherhood to access the works of Sabhapaty Swamy, as Patrick Bowen has written about. And sort of another sort of implication of the theosophical interest is Dr. Franz Hartmann, who was sort of a doctor, as Richard Kaczynski's written about, this sort of Wild West doctor as well as occultist. And he published a translation towards the end of his life, right? So he died in 1912. 1908 is when his translation of Sabhapaty Swamy was published in this journal, the Neue Lotusblüten. And for more on Franz Hartmann, I'm not going to get too much into his, his biography and life here for the sake of time, but you can see Forgotten Templars. It's a big chapter on Franz Hartmann. Sven Eek, this book on Damodar, an Indian theosophist, has a lot of information about Franz Hartmann. And then also for all of his works, you can see this bibliography, including his stay in Colorado. And he was also in Texas as well, which is really interesting. But Hartmann, sort of in his translation of part of Sri Sabhapati Swamy's works into German, he has this diagram here, right, on the physiology of the astral body. And what's interesting is the original version sort of is, it sort of lets it stand, right, as this is sort of the astral body, right? Whereas in a later theosophical edition, published in 1929, I believe, there's a footnote here. And this footnote, 1926 is the later edition. The footnote sort of reads, translated from German, Franz Hartmann in some places intentionally confused the term etheric and astral body, since he had qualms about publishing the mystery of the etheric body too early. So it's interesting here that we have sort of already this really interesting discourse between what is astral, what is etheric, how do we talk about subtle yogic bodies and chakras and all of this, in theosophy in the 1920s. And these differences between the etheric and astral bodies would continue to be formulated in discourses in the esoteric section. That's sort of a whole other topic there. And then finally, before we get into sort of the main occultist we'll study or look at today, Sabhapati's works was also incorporated and reprinted by this sort of new thought guru named William Estep, who operated out of a town in Missouri, Excelsior Springs, Missouri. he had this book called Esoteric Cosmic Yogi Science, and offered lectures sort of on new healing, new thought, and also had traveled to India, although it's not clear if he ever really met a student of Sabhapaty Swamy. He definitely encountered his books. And so, we know later too that Estep, who also had a house in Seattle, he was convicted of fraud, basically, promoting this cancer cure in Texas, in Abilene and San Antonio, and then gets sort of put in jail. It's a sort of a big scandal. But initially, he seemed to have been really interested in promoting Sabhapaty's works, although sort of, framing it as his own, I would say intervention maybe into this esoteric cosmic yogi world. But sort of the star of the day, right, is Aleister Crowley, who, is sort of one of the most famous occultists to have access and really integrate Sabhapaty's teachings into his works. And so, we have several good studies that talk about sort of Aleister Crowley's yoga in general, and sort of, India's, sort of the occult fascination with India, and its link with, different kinds of Orientalism, and all of that. And we also have Tobias Churton, right, writing sort of a more popular account of Aleister Crowley in India that is very well documented, though, gives you sort of the whole context of, Crowley's engagement. But what's interesting here and important to see is that Sabhapaty's techniques were really, I would say, deeply embedded in sort of thelemic magic, right? And so J. Gordon Melton, the scholar, has written sort of a very dated paper, though, but one of the earliest scholarly overviews on thelemic magic in America. Obviously, it's, prevalent in, elsewhere, Australia, Europe, and Japan, and elsewhere today. So, but what's interesting here is that Sabhapaty's techniques of yoga were integrated into these kinds of milieus practiced by both men and women, at Ordo Templi Orientis lodges, right, by practitioners and aspirants to the AA, as well as people who were just reading Crowley's works and wanting to practice different kinds of meditation, right, not even part of either order. So the source for this, though, it's an interesting story. We have Crowley visiting Ceylon, which today is Sri Lanka, between 1900 and 1901. He visited his friend Alan Bennett, right, who was a fellow initiate in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. And so Bennett became the second European to receive the Theravada Buddhist ordination, the first in Burma. And then prior to this, they studied yoga together during a visit with Ponnambalam Ramanathan, who was a prominent politician, as well as, a teacher of yoga, although that aspect of his life is still sort of lesser known. But following sort of their stay in, here's Sri Lanka, right? Bennett leaves for Burma, and Crowley starts to go into sort of South India. And he starts to adopt and begin to use the name Abhavananda, right? The bliss of non-being, Abhava Ananda. And he also started to become fascinated with the goddess Bhavani, to whom he even offered a sacrificial goat in a temple in Madurai. So Madurai is a really important temple city in South India here. And so he cited this inspiration from Richard Burton's illicit entry into the Kaaba at Mecca, right? Sort of dressing up in a certain way to gain entrance into a secret temple. So it's not clear exactly what temple that was, although it could have been sort of a side shrine to the Meenakshi Amman temple, or a different temple altogether in Madurai. But we know that sort of Crowley, really sort of took off with this name for a while, right? Abhavananda. It's in this diary that he wrote in 1901, right? It's this sort of, Namah Shivaya, but then you also have sort of this Ha'ain, Sefer Ha'ain, like the sort of book of nothing. And, he also even includes it here as this essay in ontology by Abhavananda. So it's clear, that he's interested in this name, this concept, and also this worship of Bhavani. And it's interesting to also see it integrated in the Lema with the book 777. You see Bhavani, in this placeholder for where you would imagine Shakti to kind of be first, right? Instead of Bhavani to be first here with all forms of Shakti. But it's interesting that Bhavani even has sort of a central position in his column where he's talking about Hindu deities and sort of linking them to the occult in Jewish Kabbalah, the tree of life, as he did with all kinds of other deities and symbols. But where exactly did Sabhapati, I guess, fit into this picture, right? So we know that Crowley is interested in South India. He's interested in yoga. He's interested in Bhavani. He's interested in, what's happening here on the ground. But there's some debate about that since, we have Gerald York writing that Crowley told him he got tantric knowledge from Sabhapaty Swamy in Madras, but there's really no evidence that Crowley met Sabhapaty Swamy personally. Crowley's own account is that he was introduced to the writings of Sabhapaty Swamy during his aforementioned journeys in Madurai through a man who spoke English well and was himself a great authority on yoga. And this is verified in a letter from Crowley to David Kerwin. So you can read in Henrik Bogdan has this brother Crowley, brother Kerwin. And he recounts that he was only at Madura for 3 days and was nobody's pupil. So that seems to be the most logical thing, that he was introduced to the works of Sabhapaty Swamy. But what's interesting here that sort of complicates it just a little bit is that Crowley elsewhere indicates that he received a teaching on yogic meditation at Madurai. So in the commentary to Blavatsky's The Voice in the Silence, he writes that he got a certain point in the body suitable for meditation from his guru in Madurai. But possibly this guru, it could have been an exaggeration in terms of who the guru really was. It could have been this man who spoke English well. And there's even some indication it could have been Karunananda Swami, who in a later advertisement for this book, The Voice in the Silence, published in the Kalpaka, claimed to be Sabhapaty Swamy's student. So there's some sort of connection happening that's possible, but there's unfortunately no proof yet. But wherever he got Sabhapaty Swamy's works from, he incorporated them into this instruction published in the Equinox called Liber HHH, and the section is SSS. And in that, there's an asana that's prescribed, preferably the thunderbolt, and the practice of the cavity of the brain is the yoni, the spinal cord is the lingam. You're instructed to concentrate the thought of your adoration in the brain, awaken the spine, and then sort of, imagine, energy going up and down along the spine in a certain very technical way. And this SSS could be, Sri Sabhapati Swamy, as well as sort of, the more Kabbalistic symbolism of Shin as fire. Although it's sort of interesting to see a kind of pun like that, if it is indeed a pun. So we know that Crowley's sort of source for this instruction, SSS, is at least partially from this diary entry, right? Or at least his engagement with this instruction and the source for this instruction is reflected in this diary entry that's published in Magic, right? The big blue brick. And we're supposed to draw the light of, your two eyes internally to Kundali by Ida and Pingala. Imagine the mind as a straight pole, right? Brahmarandra Kundali, and the consciousness at the bottom of this pole. Take hold of the consciousness by the two keennesses of your eyes and pull it slowly up, right? And keep it in Brahmarandra, drop it. It's sort of this up and down sort of cycle that we see here. What's interesting, though, is if you actually go back and examine Sabhapati's works, what he's really meaning what he's really getting at with this terminology is that keenness is really sights that proceed from the eyes. Consciousness, bhavana jnana, is really this sort of meditative cultivation, right? And gnosis by means of cultivation. Sushumna, right? Those of you familiar with yogic terminology will know it's sort of this central nadi or channel. Sabhapati likes using this word vangshi, the Tamil form vasi, which just means pipe in a way, a channel. And then kundali is not kundalini as this sort of abstract serpent, but really a place, a coil at the base of the spine that he translates sort of really idiosyncratically as the bottom and center of the spiritual organ of throwing urine, right? So it's sort of really, a technical place in the body at the base of the spine, usually linked to the Muladhara chakra. And the Brahmarandra, crevice of the Brahman, is the fontanelle, right? And in Sabhapati, he uses this terminology, divine pilgrimage, which really gets it to sort of what, Henry Olcott and others, and of course Crowley, would have been interested in this idea of, traveling in his terminology, right, in the body of light. And so this is sort of the most practical instructions where you find, Crowley's own engagement with Sabhapati's material. I would say it's really this section of Sabhapati's works where it's sort of very, precise in a certain way with the instructions. And then finally, with regard to this, it's important to note that in his other works, he really expands on these introductions by giving these numbers, and these numbers really link to visual diagrams, right, that really permeate and pervade all of Sabhapati Swamy's works. So for instance, the number 2 refers to this specific diagram on the head where this is the number 2. And this just so happens to be, in English, it's really convoluted, the organ of finite spiritual mind-like vision of fixing in itself. But if you look at sort of, what's really being said here, abhimana shuddhi, it's really this sort of purification of misconceptions about the self that's happening at this number, right? So that's why you always kind of have to look at, there's a translation, but then there's also sort of the original word that's alongside in some of Sabhapati's works that sort of lets you understand really what's being said a little more than the English translation, or in some cases a lot more. And then finally, just to sort of emphasize this idea, sort of kundali, right, being this place, you're really making what is rising for Sabhapati Swamy is this akasha, pranakasha, or ether of prana, rise like a serpent. So there is an analogy that's like kundalini, but what rises in Sabhapati's yoga is not kundalini, it's this prana or akasha, this ether that, rises, that's like a serpent here. So interesting thing to think about and keep in mind. But what happened was that, Crowley, as well as Franz Hartmann, right, both independently saw a link between yoga and ceremonial magic. And so that's very clear sort of from their works and sort of what they were trying to do. They were really harmonizing this. And, Mark Singleton has written about this, as well as Suzanne Newcomb, 2 scholars on modern yoga, about sort of the broader context for integration of yoga into techniques of magic. But it's still a really sort of big subject. It's not just unique to Crowley. I mean, clearly there were other authors like Franz Hartmann, several others who were interested in this idea. So what I want to get into for the final part of this talk is to give you some context for, what's really, at stake, I guess, in Aleister Crowley's engagement. As we've seen, it's pretty deep with Sabhapati's techniques, and sort of what is sort of the local Tamil as well as South Asian context for the system for the attainment of the royal yoga for Shiva. So as you can see, if you just sort of content, leave yourself, to access Sabhapati's English works or the works in Roman script, you're going to be left with one impression. But if you, are able to, either access his works in a vernacular language or in translation from these vernacular languages, or even his trilingual work that has both English and the Sanskrit and Tamil original, then you'll come away with, I would say, a much fuller perspective of sort of what Sabhapati is trying to say, what are his teachings of yoga. And I won't get too much into sort of the weeds in terms of the South Asian technical philosophical schools that he's drawing from, for the sake of time here. But it's important to see that there is a synthesis that's already happening in Tamil Nadu among this group known as the Tamil Veerashaivas. And for them, they're trying to really reconcile this monistic idea of unity, what we know from Vedanta, with a dualistic Shaiva Siddhanta, where sort of the practitioner is always going to be separate from Shiva, but you can kind of, be absorbed at the same time into nothing. But in Vedanta, it's this monistic idea of unity, right, with Brahman. And so there's these two sort of competing, perspectives on one's relationship with the divine, with Shiva, that's happening. And the Veerashaivas are trying to kind of reconcile these two. And Sabhapati fits very squarely in this discourse. And he's also bringing in Hatha Yoga and Raja Yoga texts composed in Sanskrit, mythological material from the Puranas, Sanskrit epics, and Tamil lore that we saw from Agastya. And then also this regional yogic and alchemical texts and traditions of the Tamil Siddhas. And there's also songs as well, and this text known as the Tirumandiram as well. So this compendium of Shaiva lore. And so what we know, just as Aleister Crowley and these other occultists were starting to access Sabhapati's works, at the same exact time, Sabhapati is not idle. He doesn't just disappear from history, following his visit as we sort of left him with in Lahore. He goes back to Madras. He publishes this trilingual work that I mentioned. And, this work is full of all kinds of new diagrams. It's full of, really interesting and vivid descriptions of sort of what's happening, more detailed than his lectures that are only in English. And he's also publishing at the same time as that, these works in Tamil that are able to be accessed. And, here's some example, with just vivid, illustrated, really sort of detailed pen and ink drawings of what's sort of, being described, what's being understood, the temple culture, the context, the landscapes of yoga, the implements that the yogi would use, all of these kinds of things. And we even know that he went to Bombay and Mumbai and published a whole other set of literature here that's in Devanagari. So, the Devanagari is a script that's used to write Sanskrit and also Hindi, at this time Hindustani, which also pulls from Urdu, right? Urdu and Hindi kind of come from a common root here. And so there's sort of a whole other aspect of this literature that's in Hindustani here. And then finally, to see this is so, this occultist stream, right? You have these works that Crowley's accessing, Franz Hartmann is translating here, FH, and then this is William Estep. So at the same time as these books are coming from his English works, you have these other works too, sort of Sabhapati's last works are being sort of, part of this institution of meditation halls that are part of a network that's even still extant today. So if you go, and I was able to trace this in my research and dissertation through village maps, and other sources, you can actually see that there's a parampara that still traces its lineage back to Sabhapaty Swamy today. That's part of the production of these texts in Tamil that was happening at the same time as the sort of translocal occultists were publishing their works. So here you have Konur Ramalinga Swāmīgal, a depiction of him. That's one of Sabhapati's students, and then his student Anandananda Swāmīgal, and then Hariharan Swāmīgal, who unfortunately just died a couple of years ago, but I had the fortune of meeting him and interviewing his son, as well as someone who knew Ramalinga Swāmīgal well, right? And so there's still a temple that exists in Konur that is part of what Sabhapati founded after he sort of came back to Madras. And, you know, in these later Tamil works, there's this whole sort of system of, you know, diagrams of sort of, you know, carrying out the instructions of the guru, music, art, you know, even cooking, right? Scribal activities, you know, what's happening at these meditation halls, you know, male students, female students, you know, all kinds of things, right? And to some extent, you know, it lives on even in the time of COVID, and especially pre-COVID, right? You have sort of these events and activities where people will come together and they'll sing songs and sort of learn meditation, they'll learn yoga, right? So to some extent, it still continues, even though, you know, it's taken a lot of different forms as far as the history has gone. And then lastly, in terms of the historical context, Sabhapati's main student that carried on the yogic legacy of Sabhapati Swamy is Om Prakash Swamy in Ooty. This is kind of nicknamed Snooty Ooty, right? It was a British hill station in the colonial period, but it was much more than that as well, like beautiful hills and forests and waterfalls. And there's a temple where Om Prakash Swamy has maintained, or his followers have maintained, his library, and Sabhapati Swamy's books can be found in this library. So here's sort of another example of sort of the context, you know, these landscapes of yoga, where Sabhapati's yoga would have been practiced, right? And a picture of Sabhapati Swamy, right, colored diagram, as well as the presence, right, of female students. And so what I want to get at in closing here is that there's at least three main types of instructions in Sabhapati's works in Indic languages. So we're confronted with this idea of, you know, okay, there's yoga, right? And so we know that occultists like Aleister Crowley, the Theosophists, you know, Franz Hartmann, Estep, you know, these others, they focused on this yoga, right? But what's interesting here is that these also inform this yoga, especially in Sabhapati's Tamil works. So you have mantra and its accompanying ritual apparatus. And then you have sort of this idea of initiations or diksha between guru and student. And these two aspects, 2 and 3, are largely absent from Sabhapati's English-only work, but they're still behind the scenes, and they're still sort of very much salient to Sabhapati's later instruction. And I would argue that they're still really of relevance to sort of, you know, esoteric practice overall, you know, and sort of for anyone who's interested to, you know, sort of carry on or practice any of these techniques, like they're still, you know, very relevant and very important. So I'll spend just a little bit of time talking about what these are. So in earlier presentations, I've sort of covered that, you know, the 3 main types of yogas for Sabhapati are Hatha Yoga, Hatha Raja Yoga, and Shiva Raja Yoga. Yoga of force, royal yoga of force, royal yoga for Shiva. And so, you know, this first one, the Hatha Yoga, is this binding of the breath. The Hatha Raja Yoga is binding of the breath and the mind. So you sort of add on to that. And then you also have sort of among this Hatha Yoga and Hatha Raja Yoga, you have sort of some integration of Patanjali Yoga. So the yoga of Patanjali, sort of from the Yoga Sutras, or the Shastra of Patanjali, right? And I won't get into the asanas so much here, but suffice to say there is even some consideration of asanas, sort of, you know, different ways that you can sit, especially 10 asanas, or 11, depending on how you count. But most important here in Sabhapati's works is this idea of Shiva Raja Yoga, which is really the subjugation of gnosis. And here again, you have sort of this tension between, is it monistic? Is this yoga, this sort of union with the Brahman, with Shiva, or is it, this nature of I am the servant? Is it this sort of dissolution into duality where sort of both parties dissolve in a way, or you dissolve into this duality? And really, he's making allowance for it being both. It just depends on how you really talk about it, right? And so the important thing to note is that Shivaraja Yoga is really a samadhi for Sabhapati, right? And samadhi can mean, it literally means composition. In popular discourse, it's often translated absorption today, right? But Sabhapati preferred communion. I prefer composure, right? Because it's sort of, it allows for both this monistic and dualistic meaning that's sort of inherent in the word, right? But it's a state. So for, in terms of this sort of like abiding state that you access, and it's unwavering, it's a composure, right? And it's also for Shiva, right? And it gives you gnosis. So I'll kind of blaze through these a little bit because I've treated on them elsewhere. But what's interesting is that there are these sort of South Indian sources for Sabhapati Shivaraja Yoga. So it's not just a Sanskrit, concept, pan-Indian concept. There's really a Tamil-specific development of Shiva Yoga, right? And so there's a work called the Shiva Yoga Pradipika. There's songs like Sitarganam, troops of Siddhas. There's this notion of a doctrine of unity. There's also references in like cosmology to this sort of fourfold internal instrument. And so there's this whole body of literature, right, that's informing this idea of Shivaraja Yoga as it entered the works of occultists like Olcott and Crowley, for example. So when, it's amazing when you pick up just sort of an instruction like Liber HHH, SSS, like what are you going to find? You're really going to find, something that is deeply linked to this whole other discourse of Shivaraja Yoga, right? And sort of this imagining also as, of the body as the Svarupa, or sort of essential nature of the Linga, right? Shiva's Linga. So there is this whole sort of body of literature that is really about that. And it's linked to also this sort of elaborate cosmology of the universal spirit, these brightnesses, spiritual rays, 12 spiritual lights and faculties, right? It's sort of really sort of linked to chakras, all kinds of, blisses and consciousness, and it's sort of very technical in that way. And so here you have this ABCs, right, that are above the head of the yogi. These are all listed, right, as these ABCs, and so on and so on. And so you can read that in his works. I won't dwell on that aspect. And then also the cosmology of it all that you see from his works, right, with these chakras and knots and granthas and adharas, right, or supports. They're all sort of, really technically elaborated. And so for Sabhapati, there's 12 in addition to these 4 kind of other states, or centers that are sort of in the head or sort of beyond the brain, right? Bottom of the brain, middle of the brain. And so I won't get into what all of these things are, but suffice to say is that it's sort of very technical and very elaborately outlined in visual form, especially in Sabhapati's works in Tamil and Hindustani. And then the precedent for some of these models of stages also, if you really want to go deep into it, is really in Tamil Yoga. So part of the talk, right, it's sort of sources, Tamil Yoga in modern occultism. Well, really, this is it. You have a scholar, Eric Steinschneider, who's analyzed texts like the Oliviloticum, right? So citing into annihilation, and the soul comes to shed its ego consciousness and become the Godhead. Right, sort of mentioned earlier, Sivam, right, Sivam I. And so there's these stages, right, tattvas, seeing the supreme, annihilation of ego consciousness. There are these 10 acts, some of which are sort of these visions. And these are elaborated in Tamil texts as well, and stages that are also elaborated as this sort of yoga for the supreme. So all of these sort of, ideas about sort of, gradual, shedding, or sort of, in some ways, really, like you're going through these chakras and you're really trying to annihilate them, right? Or you're trying to sort of terminate them in a way as not parts of yourself. But first you have to sort of activate them in a way, but it's not, this common, right? You go in popular, 21st century culture, you can go, and see like a chakra massage, right? Where you're going to balance the chakras, right? Or you're going to, somehow harmonize something. For Sabhapati, it's not about balancing anything, any kind of chakra. It's really about recognizing it as an isolated part of yourself that is somewhat, detrimental. I mean, it's not that you have to get rid of it. It's that you have to realize, though, that it's not fully yourself. So any one of these things, right, people could think, oh, this is me, but it's not really me. Well, one of these things is not going to be the individual, right? You're going to have to sort of get past all of these things before you really see who the individual is, right? As part of the supreme here, this Parai, or Shiva. And so this model also for these 3 stages is linked to Kashmiri Shaivism too. And for this, you can see Alexis Sanderson has an article, Mandala and the Agamic Identity in the Trika of Kashmir. So there's clearly some sort of resonance too with these 3 supreme goddesses that's happening in the top of the head, and these model of sort of para stages, right, that you kind of have to get to. And then what's interesting here in the vernacular that you don't really see with his works in English is mantra, right? The second category. So we saw yoga, right, which you do get in his English works, even though it's more vividly illustrated in his other works. You do see mantra and sort of ritual actions for gods and goddesses in his vernacular works much more sort of pronounced, right? And so you can even see from sort of these lists of all of these principles and ideas, you see elements, right? Element of earth, of air, of fire, of ether. You see inhaling breath, exhaling breath. You see the planets, right? Uranus, Venus, Moon, Saturn, and you see them all sort of, they're supposed to be colored in a certain way, right? I mean, occultists would, go to town with us, you can just imagine, right? Like what is being said, what is being shown. So I'll give you one example here, which is sort of a series of mantras to the Navagraha, or the 9 sort of celestial bodies, right? The 7 classical planets plus Rahu and Ketu. So you have these mantras, right? And you have, just to show you, give you an example of how they're constructed, right? You have Om Om Madhya Surya Devaya Namah Svaha, right? So you start with Om, you have Om, and then you have Madhya, who's in the center, and then you have Surya Devaya, right? So to the god of the sun, and then you have Namaha, reference, and then Svaha. And so all of the mantras sort of take this form, right? They give you the place in which the celestial body is located, and then they give you the name of the body in the dative case, according to the Sanskrit rules of mantra, and then Namaha Svaha. So you have sort of all of these formulae as well of mantra in Sabhapati's works. And if you actually look at the physical culture on how the Navagraha, so this is a Navagraha installation from the temple of Sabhapati's guru in Velachery, you can see, okay, so the sun's in the center here, and all the rest of the celestial bodies are going to be placed in a certain way, and there's going to be sort of puja, for each of these in a certain way. And what people do in Tamil Nadu, especially in these installations, is they will rotate, they'll circumambulate these Navagraha, right? And sort of recite mantras as they circumambulate it. So it's a really interesting practice, but you can see how the mantra really encodes where each Navagraha should be, right? And then lastly, I mentioned Diksha, right? This idea of initiation. And so that's another aspect of Sabhapati's works in vernacular languages that you don't really get from just his English works. And so, I'd encourage you, to the extent you can, to look at that a little more deeply. And it really sort of spans a lot of his other works, right? Because you have this in Tamil and Telugu, but then you have sort of a similar thing, right? In Devanagari, right? Sort of North Indian script. And then you also have it in English, right? Where here it's really interesting. You have blessing diksha or mesmerism, right? So that sort of opens a whole other can of worms. Okay, so what is happening here? What is really mesmeric about it? But I mean, clearly there's some sort of resemblance in terms of sort of where the hands and eyes and all of these features are going. Although at the same time, it's clear that this is an idea and a practice that predates mesmerism. So that's sort of the idea of like, going back to the source of some of these ideas and seeing them in their contexts. So that's the end of my talk for today. So Namah Shivaya Namah, right? So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, that was a wonderful talk. That was really interesting.
Yeah, thank you. I have
really great.
several nerdy questions that may be a little off the rails in terms of what you intended to present. But the first one is, I'm hoping that once your dissertation is complete, you'll at least let us read it. Or if you need an editor, not for the Sanskrit part or for the Tamil, but for the English part, you email me.
Okay. Thanks. It is complete, if I could add. I mean, which is nice. It's already all complete, so it'll be available online, I think, in a few months. So,
excellent. So I noticed that on the initial diagrams of the chakras, they had these kind of loops. Do you know what that was intended to represent? Because I'm not used to seeing, I haven't seen a loop diagram before, and I'm used to seeing something similar to that loop as a representation of the granthis or of bandhas in instruction. So do you know why those are written in loops?
So when you say loop, let me just go back through so I can get a sense of what you're talking about here. So let's see.
I think it's the same diagram that you had painted.
Was it one of these? This one right here?
Yeah. So see, there's like in the center guy, especially, you see those kind of almost as though the Sushumna is doubling over on itself, or kind of doing a little somersault on the way up. Do you know what that's about?
So, my interpretation of this is that it's a depiction of granthis.
Okay.
So granthis or knots, right? And in earlier sort of medieval tantric depictions of the body or descriptions, the granthis and the chakras and the adras, the supports, they would actually be separate things in a way, or different texts would treat them separately, you might know about. And then, but for Sabhapati, he really kind of collapses them into a single sort of concept. He refers to them as kamalams or lotuses, right? Kamalas, and as well as in English, kingdoms. But he doesn't, to my knowledge, use the word granthi, but it's clear that there is some kind of knot, right? Like visual depiction happening here. Yeah.
So then in terms of the kind of sticking with these diagram issues, the bits that are coming out of the top of the figures' heads, in a way, I want to equate those to the Ein Sof, above the tree of life. But I'm wondering if those have correspondences to, say, the particular set of tattvas that were used in the system that he was raised in, or if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so these up here, these sort of higher chakras in the head, so to speak, there are these four up here, right, that he talks about, Palastana, Tatparastana, Parasthana, and Parapara. So these are sort of, linked also to the thousand-petaled lotus, right, and then different parts of the crevice of the Brahman, right, and he really talks about them as this sort of end of the 12, which is another technical terminology in yoga. the Dvadashanta. So, I mean, in terms of what they represent in terms of tattvas, I think they're beyond at least most of what we think of as like, any kind of physical tattva, because the physical tattvas are down here. And then there are some of the other sort of links, if you study his literature, with like subtle elements and senses and all of that down here. But, they really sort of represent in some of his other sort of writings, I would say, like they're higher aspects of, right here we have nada, which is a sound, and then kala is like a fragmented energy of Shiva. So it's kind of this idea of fragmented energy. And then these three supremes here, which, as I mentioned, I think that they're linked to these concepts of the three goddesses, which are sort of, beyond certain, or higher tattvas as well. So, yeah.
Sure. So I'm also kind of fascinated that he was using I think it was 12 chakra system, because some of those survive in some lineage traditions that I know of. They're still using, for example, Bindu as a separate chakra, but it's not, the place that's described under bodily location here belongs to Ajna, even though Bindu is vocabulary that's used to describe a part in sort of the back of the head. So I've always blamed Ledbetter for being kind of the jerk who ruined chakras for the West, because in his book on the chakras, I don't know if you've seen the diagram, but there's a diagram of a human, and basically where one would imagine the chakras are supposed to be, he's used planets instead, including the sun and the moon, which obviously don't accord with most of the systems that are native to the Indian subcontinent. So I guess this is sort of an open-ended question that goes both to Ledbetter ruining chakras for the rest of us, and to Crowley's decision to obsess about Patanjali, when we know that he read the Garanda Samhita, we know he read the Shiva Samhita, like he's got other texts that he could have referred to. So do you have any thoughts on why, if Crowley and the Theosophists had access to material that, showed that we're not looking at the 7 chakra model as the only potential model that's out there? So I guess the first question is, did they just sort of lazily graft onto, hey, we have lots of other things with 7 chakras, we got, and then all the classical 7s. And then sort of the second part of that is, given that during Crowley's life, he had access to more primary texts and to living teachers, whether they were lineage teachers or not, what's up with his freaking love affair with Patanjali?
Okay. Yeah. As for your first question, I think, what I found useful in my work is to sort of distinguish between the Theosophical camp and the Thelema camp, right? Or Crowley for simplicity, in terms of his literature. And what you see is that there was an attempt in Theosophy really to make things fit this sacred, septenary model, right, of the 7. And at the same time, though, like the model of the chakras and yoga, like a lot of this was still very new and very grounded in, Indian vernacular sources that not all Theosophists had access to. So, Sri Chandra Boshu, who I mentioned, was to my knowledge, the first translator of the Garanda Samhita, and he also translated the Shiva Samhita, which had teachings on the chakras that fit sort of the 6+1 model. And what I've come to the conclusion of in terms of study of Crowley's integration of chakras, Crowley's following the Shiva Samhita really pretty directly. And so what happened is that I think in Theosophy, they took sort of, some of the teachings of the chakras from these texts, but then they also added, like, as you said, from Ledbetter, sort of, like the spleen, right? And ideas of like, sort of bodily organs and planets, and sort of to fit the Theosophical model of tattvas that they were promoting. And, in terms of, why Crowley didn't engage, I guess, like this, for instance, the 12, fold model of Sabhapati, I don't know. But I mean, I think he could have read really the, similar, this idea of lotuses and chakras, and sort of seen it as linked, right? Because he was more keen to sort of see, to my knowledge, ritual efficacy as more important than sort of getting caught in the cosmological details of, like, how many chakras there are, and all of these kinds of things. And I really think that that's sort of how these yogis were as well, right? I mean, to most extent, right? There were these elaborate systems, but there were also such a rich variation, and there was an emphasis on sort of, okay, well, what do you actually do with them? You know what I mean? That's where at least Sabhapati falls, because he even critiques the Theosophists for not being practical enough in some ways, in one of his works, right? Just having too many theories. And so, you could make the same charge to a lot of groups, right? It's not just Theosophists. Sure. So, yeah.
Sure.
And the second part with Patanjali, that's a good question. I think that, so David White has this book on sort of the biography of the Yoga Sutras. Mm-hmm. And I think there's this emergence of interest in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras during the colonial period. It's fostered by translations, fostered by this kind of renaissance of interest in Patanjali as sort of this locus, the center of the text on yoga. And it clearly, it's so important. And there were sort of groups and living traditions that were still borrowing from Patanjali. And you even see it, like I presented on in Sabhapati, he brings in some aspects of Patanjali, even though he never mentions Patanjali's name in, the context of these instructions. So I think that Patanjali had a staying power, but really the sort of re-emergence of interest in Patanjali as the most important text on yoga, really we start to see in the colonial period, right? With sort of occultists accessing it and seeing it as the most important model, right? With like the 8 limbs, the auxiliaries and all that. And it's also sort of the convenient schema of it, right? Because you can sort of map different practices onto this.
Start here, go on to step 2. Like now you get to here. Like.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm just sort of fascinated that, being so taken with Patanjali as the be-all, end-all of yoga. I mean, it's certainly something that Iyengar promoted. So presumably, he got that from his guru as well. But it's really stuck in modern Western postural yoga that Patanjali is like the man, capital TM. But it hasn't really stuck in, say, the Indian subcontinent, like in the same way that it has in the West. So I'm just always curious as to how people look at that. So one other question, I could probably monopolize you all night, but I'll leave with this last one. So while the English translations tend to cut out the idea of the diksha or the sort of Shaktipat transmission, I noticed that, without getting into things we shouldn't talk about on video, that there are certain types of touching that are used in some of the rituals that Crowley has written, where he, drops a footnote about quote unquote activating a certain chakra or something. So I don't think the idea was necessarily completely lost, even though it wasn't made in the translations, but it's gone from in my opinion, it seems like it's gone from a Shaktipat type transmission to if I poke this thing, it turns it on, like I'm pushing the button kind of thing. Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, the idea.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, so we don't really know, that's kind of the problem, is we don't really know if Crowley received any physical initiations in India, from anyone, although he might have sort of received techniques, from different gurus. We don't know if he received any kind of mantra, there's no evidence that he did. Sure. And so we kind of have to say, okay, well, he probably didn't. And if he's saying in his own words that he sort of is just receiving, the literature of, these teachings, and Sabhapati, and on one level, that's fine. I mean, Sabhapati writes, or, I think in one of the translations, maybe the Bengali translation, it's saying that this work is something that you can even use without a guru, right? So there is this sort of invitation of using it on its own. But in terms of sort of, where Crowley got the material for sort of, there's striking similarities, right, of the touching and the laying on hands, but that's also something that comes, from mesmerism, that comes from sort of other sources, right? I mean, you even see Pentecostals, right, doing the laying on hands. So it's kind of hard to say, okay, well, is it from an Indian context? I mean, I don't know. But what's interesting, though, about this context is that it's clear that it lives on, and that it's an important part of sort of, the Tamil yogic milieu of this relationship between a guru and student, of touching different parts. And I don't think that comes from mesmerism. So I don't know where Crowley got it from, but it's clear that there is sort of a distinct tradition of this sort of, points of contact, between guru and student. Yeah.
I lied. I have one more question.
Okay.
So in looking at Crowley's experience with yoga, the vast majority of what he seems to have experienced personally was filtered through his studies with Alan Bennett, and those were presented in sort of a Buddhist context. Well, in a Buddhist context, let's be frank. So I know that as the Tantras were emerging centuries before all of this stuff, they eventually had a great impact on how the direction that Buddhism took after that point. And so do you see in looking at the writings of Crowley things that are like echoes of, yeah, he's using the Buddhist lingo, but this is something that comes from one of these Sri Vidya traditions, or are there other little details like that you catch every so often, or no?
Yeah, I would say that there are, and I think the question of Crowley and Buddhism, I know Gordan Djordjevic has written a little bit on this, but there's what's interesting to me is, first of all, what comes to mind is so there's evidence from a scholar, Karen O'Brien Bopp, I think, yeah, Karen O'Brien Bopp. So Karen. She's written about the role of Buddhism in sort of the formulation of Patanjali's yogic system itself, right? And so, even if you're even going to even engage Patanjali yoga and sort of, the techniques that are used, the terminologies that's used, this idea of even sort of later, in Buddhism, this cultivation, the bhavanas, right, that Sabhapati also uses, it's never going to be really far from Buddhism, right? It's going to be, they arose in response to each other, or sort of as part of this sort of symbiotic relationship, at least from my understanding of that research. And so that's one thing. And then, and the second part, when Crowley was studying yoga with Alan Bennett in Sri Lanka, I think even then, sort of Buddhism as it was practiced on the ground was still sort of much more fluid in terms of sort of the way that, the standardization factor, really, because Olcott, to my knowledge, was one of the main instrumental figures in the standardization of Sri Lankan Buddhism, right? He contributed to the development of this catechism, I think of Buddhism. And Donald Lopez has actually written a chapter in this recent volume. It's called Imagining the East, and it's on sort of theosophical interactions with India. And he's talked about too this idea, sort of a tension that was happening between Indologists like Max Muller, who were sort of wanting to maintain a more sort of Protestant view of Buddhism, right, as this kind of like reform, very sort of polycanon is the oldest canon that there is, and all of this kind of thing. And then he was sort of having a point of tension with theosophical interest in Buddhism that was more interested in sort of I think esoteric aspects of Buddhism. A lot of the Mahayana, Vajrayana texts, they hadn't been translated, they hadn't been accessed, but there was sort of burgeoning interest at that time.
Let's ransack it and see what we can take for theosophy.
Yeah, in at that time. And I think that Crowley sort of was living at a time in which, if those texts would have been more widely available, I'm sure they would have sort of found expression in his writing. But, there is evidence, right, that he engaged, at least to some extent. I'm forgetting the exact reference, but I know that there's evidence that the Saundarya Lahari, right, this kind of like wave of beauty, right, ocean of beauty, was around at the time in which he was writing. And I think Alan Bennett may have had a copy of that book. And so there's definitely some sort of evidence that he was engaging with like that milieu to a very limited extent, and then that was sort of expressed through his understanding of Buddhist meditation. So it's all sort of intertwined, I would say, for Crowley. Yeah.
Thank you for humoring me, and thank you for your presentation. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you for the good questions. I have to do more research.
So one of the things that you talked about, you went through quickly, and I wrote a couple notes down on it. It seems like this notion of the double is an important mediating term between occultism and Indian spirituality. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that and how you understand that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So where to start? The double emerges as a theosophical concept, though. And so I don't know if there's really a specific parallel for it in the Indian discourse. I know that Sabhapati is sort of framing this idea of the projection of the double, what Theosophists would call projection of the double. He's framing it as a pilgrimage, right? This sort of divine pilgrimage in his English sort of translation. And then in other contexts, he's framing it in the terminology of bhavanas, right? Sort of this cultivation, but really like a meditative visualization of sorts. And then that's also linked in his text too, to where we might get some conception of the double, I guess, is he does have these meditations that I alluded to on the body as the svarupa, or inherent nature, right, essential nature of the linga, of Shiva's linga. So that really is this kind of projection onto the body, but it's not really like the double, I guess, as like I'm seeing a body in front of me, if that makes sense. That's like a double that I'm sort of like projecting into, as much as sort of there's this sort of cosmic, potency, right? Or sort of, principle that's full of energy, right? Full of Shakti, that is sort of mapped onto the body. And that is sort of the double for Sabhapati, I guess, if you were going to read that into it. But he never uses the word double.
Right. I knew that he didn't use that term. I was trying to remember exactly what you said, but that was the word that jumped out.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Well, thank you, Keith. That was fantastic.
Thank you for having me.
It was a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. I took a lot of notes, and I'll probably have other questions later that I'll follow up with you on once I've had a chance to digest it a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. I'm happy to answer anything, by email or, just hopefully we'll be in touch out of this social distance world soon too.
We absolutely will. Yes.
Looking forward to it.